Thank you to the Canadian Women Artist History Initiative for bringing us all together and for creating this platform, even amidst COVID and all the complications of academic life this year. I've especially admired the model that Janice Anderson and Christina Huneau have created through this project. As Martha mentioned, my name is India Young, and I'm speaking as an uninvited visitor on Lekwungen land. And even while participating in this conference virtually, I'm mindful that the Canadian Women Artists History Initiative operates from the ancestral homelands of the Panacahaga. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to present this research, and I extend that gratitude to these Indigenous nations in particular. New to the Royal BC Museum and Archives in 2020, I was looking for a project that would help me learn about the artworks in our collection. Known best for Emily Carr and powerhouse Indigenous women artists like Ellen Neal, Ellen Curley, and Anaslaga, the Royal BC Museum suffers the classic tip of the iceberg syndrome. And so, piggybacking on the Canadian Women Artist History Initiative, I've worked with a team of volunteers to write biographies for 70 women artists whose histories cannot be found on Google or even often in collections of other institutions. These women's primary legacies remain the artworks they created themselves, which were likely collected by the women artist counterparts of their eras. One such woman, Hilda Vincent Foster, quickly captured my imagination with the 21 whimsical, striking watercolors that appear to have arrived in the archives shortly after she passed away in the 1970s, whereafter they were promptly lost to time. The museum has no records of exhibitions. Indeed, their matting, backings, and frames, or lack of frames, suggest that they were quietly boxed away and stacked alongside many of the other artworks by women artists we've recently been recollecting. Hilda Vincent Foster, who went by Vince, was the president of the Edmonton Art Club in the late 1930s and the Victoria Sketch Club throughout the 1960s. She exhibited in Montreal and Toronto, including with the Royal Academy of the Arts, and was instrumental in supporting art societies in the West, including my personal favorite art society, the Women's Sketch Hunters Club, who trekked through the Rockies Alpine with canvases, paper, and paints. During her lifetime, Foster hosted countless artist compatriots at her homes in Edmonton, Mill Bay, and Victoria, organized exhibitions at universities, conventions, and fairs, and won many prizes for her own watercolors. Her work was often described as, quote, particularly pleasing, quote, beautiful, and, quote, clever. Are these the banal descriptors of overhurried local newspaper columnists? The artworks themselves, oops, I'm one slide behind. The artworks themselves certainly hold their own. 2 series of works remain in the care of the BC Archives. 6 paintings illustrate the legend of Savory Island, which appears to be depictions of a local legend that Foster first presented in Edmonton in 1941 after her first visit to Vancouver Island, and either returned to or represented or recreated in the early 1960s. The archives contains a handwritten version of the story. Today, though, I'm focusing on the second series of subjects historical to these lands known as British Columbia. While the watercolors are not dated, they were likely painted in the 1960s when British Columbia and Canada held a flurry of centennials from 1958 to 1971. The era's newspapers record historical paintings exhibitions throughout the province in that decade. The Victoria Sketch Club was routinely invited to contribute to such exhibitions at the newly established Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, the Nanaimo Art Gallery, and other regional venues. Foster's paintings show the hallmarks of such exhibitions, with hand-cut mats aged by time, piecemeal temporary frames. And from the backs of these 2 works, we can see a handwritten entry slip to one such exhibition where Foster includes a generic title, historical subject, her address, and notes NFS, not for sale. And the other example exemplifies the make-do matting of an artist using a cardboard box, hole punch reinforcers, and string to secure the construction paper watercolor into its mat to allow it to hang. As president of the Victoria Sketch Club in this era, Foster ensured the entire club had opportunities to exhibit throughout the region. Foster also organized lectures, outings, models, and she often assigned subject matter at monthly sketch club meetings. In the Victoria Sketch Club Fonds, which are also housed at the BC Archives, Foster's prescriptive subjects seemingly suit the general conformity of Victoria's notoriously conservative arts community, with topics like agriculture, recreation, and springtime. And yet, at least twice, Foster returned to Fort Victoria's chain gang as subject matter. Both iterations come with long calligraphic descriptions in the artist's hand. She writes, 100 years ago in Victoria, prisoners from the fort worked on the roads in a chain gang. The chain gang emerged every morning from a side gate of the yard on Bastion Street with 2 guards in the rear with loaded shotguns. The bright colors and Art Deco design style at first obscure the strangeness of her subject, and still she paints with precision, perfectly detailing the fort's bastion, the buildings within the fort, and even the clothing worn by the prisoners of their era. Foster apparently scoured tomes on the history of British Columbia to paint such vivid pictures with historically accurate details. And here's another example of one of her historical subjects, which is one of my favorite. And her handwritten description reads, Camosun, the native name for Victoria. The gathering of camas was a ceremony and the only starch in native diet. For those who know Victoria well, one can place themselves precisely within the Garry Oak Meadow that overlooks what we call today Cattle Point and Discovery and Chatham Islands. Every spring, this meadow fills with camas flowers beneath arbutus trees and Garry Oaks. From the bark of the arbutus to the 6 petals of the camas, to the cedar bark capes that drape the shoulders of Wessanic women, Foster has reimagined a historical moment with enviable precision and imagination. In recent years, Songhee's harvester, Cheryl Bryce, has publicly recognized the long Indigenous harvesting history of this specific place. But from where did Foster learn it? As a point of comparison, here are some of Foster's fellow artists at the Victoria Sketch Club, painting landscapes and historical subjects. Both Lillian Sweeney and Betty Newton, like Foster, were well known in Victoria's art circles and were lifelong members of the Sketch Club. These paintings typify the 20th century watercolors held at the BC Archives. They present skilled artists keenly observing their environments. By the mid-20th century, artist societies tended towards white women working in watercolor rather than acrylic or oils, who gathered together to paint over cups of tea and to exhibit primarily through artist societies of their peers. Rarely did their artworks find themselves in monographic exhibitions organized by curators of regional or national galleries. And yet Betty Newton was a professional exhibition designer and illustrator at the Provincial Museum. And Lillian Sweeney, albeit for only a short while, ran a gallery. And Foster was a lifelong artist. In the historical record, pieced together almost exclusively from short newspaper blurbs about exhibitions at the Hudson Bay and Eaton's, these 3 women quickly become indistinguishable. Their works are uniformly pleasing or notable. An article from 1969 about the club begins, the Victoria Sketch Club. In the minds of most, what image did these words evoke? Namely, probably, that a group of gracious but unworldly individuals, the majority women, who meet now and again to produce works of art that, while graceful and attractive, have little to say to the world of today. Is that a fair picture? Whether fair or not, the assumption remains. The historical record paints a clear picture of a certain class and group of women circumscribed to a specific and small art world. Linda Nochlin might mock that I have, quote, swallowed the bait of the woman problem by attempting to rehabilitate a rather modest, if interesting and productive career, end quote. And still, as my research pulled me further into the circumstances of Foster's biography, I learned that her artworks carry her biography to her legacy communities today. I had the true pleasure of interviewing women who remember Vince, or more often the mothers whose mothers remember Vince. Her artworks hang on their walls. They remember that she and her life partner drove across the Rockies in the 1930s with a coupe and a rumble seat, that she liked to swim in Todd Inlet, and that she and her partner hosted artists to their home in Cobble Hill. 3 of the 4 elderly women pictured in that Sketch Club article were Miss, not Mrs. These striking, atypical historical paintings and subjects offered me the opportunity to revisit the contributions that Foster made to her arts community and the spaces that she actively cultivated. The writing in of her biography has also become the writing in of a portion of Victoria's gay community. Her community remembers her, and now so do we. Thanks everyone for listening, and this is ongoing research, so I really appreciate any feedback.